This session has been organized by ICMDA South Asia in association with the National Christian Medical Fellowships of the South Asian countries. I invite Dr. Nirupama to give us a brief overview of ICMDA. Dr. Nirupama is from Sri Lanka. Over to you, Dr. Nirupama.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, let me introduce you to ICMDA, International Christian Medical and Dental Association. We are there for preaching and healing, as Jesus called us. And we have a history spanning for over 100 years. And we are a group, a combination of groups from different nations. And our vision is a Christian witness through doctors and dentists in every community, in every nation. And our mission is to start and strengthen national Christian medical and dental movements through calling, fellowship, equipping, and service. And our inspiration, we aim to walk in the footsteps of the great physician, the Lord Jesus Christ, who sent his disciples to preach the gospel and heal the sick. So, would you like to join? So yeah, we are open for anyone who are joining our family. Please feel free to contact us even during this webinar, because there are different sources like this. We'll be posting this into the chat box if you would like to join us. And from 1963 in Amsterdam, we had around 6 groups joining us for our International Congress. And in 2023, it was 107 groups, and we are expecting around 120 groups in Jeju 2026. So maybe you will also be a part of it. Please join us and contact us. And this is our list of our members from throughout the world. And we have 14 regions. South Asia is also one group. So we are trying our best to span it around and increase the number of people joined to our family. So this is our family. You will also be a part of it. Please contact us if you're a medical professional and also a doctor or maybe a student. Please contact us and join us. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sudeep.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nirupama, for telling us about ICMDA. So now LGBTQ and gender issues are the pressing in South Asia. Joining us to provide in pediatrics, University College London, a senior researcher at the Faraday Institute, Cambridge, and president of the UK Christian Medical Fellowship. He has a clinical background as a pediatrician, caring for the sick and premature infants, and also medical scientist researching in the prevention of brain injury in newborn babies. He has always been interested in ethical dilemmas raised by advances in medical technology and has frequently engaged in publication faith. His book, Matters of Life and Death, Human Dilemmas in the Light of the Christian Faith, has been translated in more than 10 languages. So may I welcome Dr. John Wyatt for the program.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure for me to join this international webinar today. And this is a really complicated and challenging topic. I'm going to share my screen, and here is the PowerPoint slides. There's a QR code there. If you would like to use that, you can download all the slides, but I've also made them available as a PDF, and so they'll be available after the talk for everyone who needs it, requests it. So this is a complicated issue. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and after that, there's going to be time for question and answer and discussion. And, you know, have some sympathy with me. This is not easy to do. Partly, it's very difficult to give a talk on such a sensitive topic when you're dealing with such an emotionally and sensitive personal issue. At least if I was giving a talk in a room, I'd be able to see your expressions and read the room. But I can't do that. I'm just speaking into the void and on the internet. And then, this is also a rapidly changing topic. Year by year, there are new developments. So that's part of the complexity. And my experience is primarily in the UK and with Western issues, and I have much less understanding of these issues within the Indian and Southeast Asian context. So for all these reasons, I'm going to do my best, but please recognize the challenges and issues which we face. So the place, I think, to start is just to recognize how much this has now, these topics have impacted the world of healthcare, the world of education, the world of business. In fact, every single aspect of our lives is impacted by these issues. And here is a gay pride march in central London. The entire traffic is brought to a halt. It's a time of great exuberance, celebration, excitement, and one that has very high levels of public support. It's one that impacts the generations, and so the rainbow has now become this marker of LGBTQ plus affiliation. It's often the whole atmosphere is seen as very positive, celebrating diversity. Young children are involved. It's become a standard feature now of education in state and private education in the West. And corporate institutions, businesses have also recognized that being seen as promoting and supporting LGBTQ issues is good for business. It helps to promote a positive image. The transgender issues, again, are increasingly common. Transgender parents. So this is a woman who's received male sex hormones, transgender pregnancies. Organizations such as Stonewall in the UK are very influential. They promote an LGBTQ agenda. And many large organizations such as the BBC and other organizations use Stonewall, this LGBTQ activist organization, to guide their policies. Here are two extraordinary slides. This one showing from America, the rise in the self-identification as non-heterosexual. So in 2012, it's about 4%, and just 11 years later, it's 7.6%. Almost a doubling, in other words, of the numbers of people who classify themselves as non-heterosexual. This is in the US, but the figures for Generation Z, those born after 1997, are even more startling. So as you can see, the percent who classify themselves as LGBTQ plus, 2% amongst the baby boomers, rising to 22% among Generation Z. In other words, about 1 in 4 of people in the USA in the Generation Z age group classify themselves as non-heterosexual. So an extraordinary rise. And this is a global phenomenon. So although I'm sure that the figures are not the same in India and Southeast Asia, there's no doubt that this phenomenon is spreading out from the West and affecting every culture. In the workplace, what's now called equality, diversity, and inclusion is very common in the workplace, in healthcare, and so on. And in the UK, the Equality Act 2010 gave 9 legally protected characteristics, which are all listed on the slide. And you can see that gender reassignment, biological sex, and gender are all part of that. Actually, just to go back to this, this is both a threat and an opportunity for Christian people in the UK, because although the law protects transgender people, those with different genders or biological sex, it also protects religion, and therefore it's possible for Christians as a minority group to claim legal protection for our own beliefs, practices, and so on. So, some definitions, just very briefly. Gender dysphoria is a psychological or emotional distress experienced as a consequence of a mismatch between a person's biological sex, and this is sometimes now described as sex assigned at birth, and their personal sense of their own gender identity. And statistics about the incidence of gender dysphoria vary, but there's no doubt that there has been a very significant increase in gender dysphoria, particularly in young people, Generation Z, and so on. It's very important to distinguish gender dysphoria and transgender issues from intersex. Intersex is a very rare condition in which chromosomal sex is inconsistent with phenotypic sex, or in which the phenotype is not classifiable as either male or female. And so, as you can see, this is extremely rare. It does happen. I've cared for babies in my own clinical practice with intersex, but it's about 1 in 5,500 births, very approximately. So extremely rare, whereas gender dysphoria is much more common. So how on earth do we as Christians try to engage with these extremely complex, strange, challenging issues in the world in which we live? And I think it's just important to recognize what a great divide there is between, on the one hand, the world of the Bible and of Christian faith, and on the other hand, this complex, rapidly changing, technologically orientated, ethically pluralistic world, the modern world. And our task, if we wish to engage for Christ in this modern world, is that we need to learn how to build a bridge between these two worlds, which are so separated, so divided. How do we build this bridge? And in order to build a bridge where you have a wide divide, the engineers say you need to have very deep foundations on both sides of the divide. So for us as Bible-believing faithful Christians, our desire is to have very deep foundations into the biblical truth, to really understand the Bible and biblical truth. But at the same time, we also need to really develop a means of developing deep foundations in the modern world. That means to try to understand the philosophy, the psychology, and the political forces and so on that are going on in our modern world. Because it's only if we have deep foundations on both sides of the divide that we're going to be able to build a bridge, find a way of connecting biblical truth with the modern world. And this task is not easy. And it's also, because although the historic Bible truth doesn't change, the modern world does. And therefore, this task is a constant one of development, challenging, questioning, learning how to build this bridge. So where do we start? Well, I think the first place we start, if we want to follow the example of Christ, is that we have to recognize the level of suffering that these issues cause. I'm very struck at the contrast between the image, which is often such one of celebration and joy and satisfaction and so on, and the reality, which is that people with gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction frequently have very high levels of mental distress. They have an increased incidence of a range of mental disorders. And in many countries, in fact, most countries, they're subject to increased social bullying, to ostracism, shaming, various kinds of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and so on. And the statistics show that they have a greatly increased risk of suicide. So our first calling, I think, is to show compassion and empathy for those who are suffering. And this is particularly important for Christian health professionals because we often, as health professionals, come into direct contact with people with same-sex attraction or with transgender people. And part of our calling may be to be an advocate for those who suffer social oppression, they're shamed, and to fight against forms of discrimination and abuse, because these are evil things which for people who are made in God's image. But sadly, the public Christian voice on LGBTQ issues often seems entirely negative, judgmental, and even homophobic. Now, homophobia is a word which is spread around, but it's important just to understand what it actually means. Homophobia is a phobia, and all phobias, like a phobia of spiders or a phobia about heights, homophobia is a phobia about homosexuality, about same-sex attraction. It's an irrational and unthinking fear of and prejudice against people who appear strange and threatening, and people who have different sexual preferences and practices from us. And we need to distinguish, therefore, homophobia, which is an irrational fear of and prejudice against people, with a disagreement. The fact that we're called to be compassionate, to defend people with same-sex attraction, doesn't mean that we have to agree or collude with everything that they say or they stand for. But that is not the same as homophobia, which is about an irrational fear. So I just want to very briefly, before we get on to Christian responses, I just want to try and outline the sort of philosophy, the mainstream philosophy, which LGBTQ activists and organizations like Stonewall promote. So this is what the LGBTQ philosophy is. First of all, they argue that biological sex and social gender are unrelated. So they say that gender is the assumption of a particular social role, but it's central to one's own unique personal identity. That's the first thing. Gender really matters. It's about my identity. The second thing, each individual is free to choose and create, and if necessary, change their own social and personal identity, including choosing whatever gender role they wish to play in society. And therefore, if I have taken on a gender role of being a male today, there's no reason why tomorrow I might choose to take on the gender role of a woman, or maybe as somebody who's gender neutral. This is entirely a matter of personal choice, and I am free to do that. Thirdly, not only is this a matter of choice, it's something of supreme importance. So they argue that my sexual and gender identity is really central to who I am. And if you attempt to deny me my sexual identity, you're causing me severe mental harm. And this is a form of oppression and abuse. And so I've got to battle to express my own freedom against all oppression. Even if you just disapprove of what I'm doing, you disapprove of my sexual behavior, that in itself is, they claim, oppressive, abusive, offensive, and downright morally evil. And this means that health professionals must adopt a kind of mask of neutrality, even if actually I am appalled or offended by what my patient is doing and the way they're behaving, I must adopt a mask of neutrality when I meet them and engage with them. Fourth, sexual and gender identities are at the root of all social oppression and discord, and the source of unending power battles in society. This is where the Marxist ideology comes into LGBTQ philosophy. Society is just divided into the oppressors and the oppressed. And the oppressors are the straight majority, and the oppressed are the those who are the LGBTQ minority. And what they argue is that the straight majority use religion and conventional morality as a form of oppression. It's a way they use in order to abuse and enforce their will on minorities. And they like to use this word, the queer minorities, as a badge of pride. We are, quotes, queer. We're not straight. So that's just a very brief outline of what is a very complex. And if you would like to study more, I recommend these two books by Carl Trueman. The one on the left, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a pretty heavy tome, but it's a very helpful explanation of the historical development of many of these factors, and the one on the right is a shorter version, a more accessible version of the same material. So we've talked about the secular world. Now, how on earth do we build a bridge to relate this to the world of biblical truth? So, in order to do that, I'm going to use this fourfold biblical foundation. Those of you who've done a bioethics training with me will know that this is a framework I use in all my bioethics teaching. But it's a very helpful framework. Whenever you find an issue and you think, how on earth do I relate this to Christian thinking, I suggest you use this framework. So we start with thinking about creation, about the way that God has made the world, the way he's made us as human beings. And then we move on to the fall, the way that everything in society is contaminated by evil. Then to redemption, how is God in Jesus Christ and through the church aiming to buy back the fallen and evil things for Christ through the power of the cross, and ultimately future hope. Where is this leading? What's the final end game as we look into the future? Okay, so I'm going to go through those four very rapidly. First of all, creation. So the Bible is very clear that God creates us as a sexually dimorphic being, or as sexually dimorphic beings. We are created male and female. And it is interesting, isn't it, that Genesis 1:26, right at the beginning, puts that very explicitly. Part of our image of being made in God's image is that we are equally male and female. We are sexually dimorphic. And this is part of God's creation. We're created as equal but complementary beings. And in fact, in our relationships, as many Bible theologians have related the fact that we are created male and female, but that we are then designed to relate to one another, and in particularly in marriage, we become one flesh. That this ability, these different persons who are also united, we reflect the triune God, and the three persons of the Trinity reflect union and communion. They are both united as one God, and yet they are different. The three persons are in communion. However, I think it's important to understand that the Bible does not lay down clear gender roles. This is what husbands should do. This is what wives should do. I mean, there are broad outlines, as we know, in the epistles, but we should be cautious in claiming that particular cultural stereotypes are supported by Scripture. It strikes me how much latitude there is in understanding particular gender roles within Scripture as a whole. Although sex and gender are important, they are by no means the most important aspects of our identity. So, unlike the LGBTQ activists who argue these are the most important things about our lives, this is a very modern idea. For ever since the time of Christ until really the 19th century, people would have thought it was ridiculous that sex was highlighted as the most important part of human identity. It's really only since Freud and then the sexual revolution in the 1960s and so on that the idea that sex and gender are crucially important. This is a new idea. And the Bible says, no, that's not right. And it also says we do not define our own identities or meaning. It's not for me to decide what my identity. It is God himself who defines who we are and calls us to live lives which reflect his unique calling on us. God saw you and knew you and loved you before the foundation of the world as a unique being, and he called you into existence here in the 21st century. And there's a modern worship song which has this line repeatedly, I am who you say I am. And I think that's a very profound line. In other words, it's not me who defines my identity, it is God himself. And actually, this is not a kind of oppression, it's a form of liberation. I don't have to try and preserve my identity or defend it against attack. I am who God says I am. I think another and related issue to this is that the historic biblical thinking makes a clear distinction between sexual genital relationships and intimate non-sexual friendships. And sexual relationships are confined to marriage, which is intended to be heterosexual, monogamous, lifelong, intimate, and exclusive. Whereas friendships are something different, but also very important. They are intended to be non-sexual, non-exclusive, non-coercive, but they should be intimate, committed, and loving. So that's just a very brief outline of creation as it applies to this. Now, but what about the fall? Well, evil has contaminated every aspect of our existence, and hence our sexuality and our understanding of our identity has become contaminated and distorted. So all of us live with a sense of dissonance between what God says is true of us and what we actually experience in everyday life. Many commentators see this in Romans 7, where Paul says, oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of flesh? So even though he's the apostle, he experiences this sense of dissonance between what God has called him to be and his body and his bodily existence. And one way of expressing this is the concept of alienation. So the effect of the fall, the effect of evil, is to alienate us from God, to alienate us from other people, and even to alienate us from ourselves and our own bodies. And so because we are fallen beings, our sexual desires, our sexual activities become disordered. They no longer reflect the good creation order. And I think it's helpful to see, therefore, that gender dysphoria, gender ambiguity, oppression, sexual, psychological abuse, stigma, all these things are expressions of the fall. And so we shouldn't be too surprised that in a fallen world, sexual orientation is not exclusively binary, that same-sex attraction is present, and it may change over the life course. And so instead of a source of joy and fulfillment, for many people, sex becomes an area of tension, hurt and pain. Some people find they've always been same-sex attracted from early childhood, and for them this seems to be constitutional. Something they have it's not a matter of choice, it's just the way I am. It's very important to understand that Christian thinking always draws a distinction between the person including their sexual orientation on the one hand and their chosen behaviors on the other. Each person is unique, supreme value and worth and loved by God for who they are. But each of us is accountable for the way we choose to behave. We're not blindly programmed. We have the dignity of choice. Due to the fall, we all behave in ways that fall short of God's standards. Our behavior becomes distorted. But in biblical thinking, temptation is not the same as sinful behavior. Jesus was tempted in all aspects as we are, but without sin. So to experience disordered sexual desires is not in itself sinful. It's also important to avoid the suggestion that those whose sexual behavior is immoral are sinners, whilst we are not. In God's eyes, spiritual pride and pharisaical hypocrisy are just as abhorrent as sexual immorality. But we must repent of the sins of sexual and psychological abuse and of blatant homophobia that Christian people have sometimes been guilty of. And many people within the LGBTQ communities are victims of the abuse of others, and sadly, including those who say they're Christians. So we must start with the humility to recognize and confess our own failings and blind spots before we comment negatively on the behavior of others. So what about redemption? And I'm coming towards the end. So Jesus both affirms the goodness of created binary sexuality whilst he challenged cultural stereotypes. So he remained a celibate male, which was unheard of amongst the rabbis. People at the time would have thought that was deeply weird. And he had intimate but non-sexual friendships with both men and women. And many of them were outraged by the way that Jesus had close friendship with women. He demonstrated that it was possible to be a complete and perfect human being without being sexually active. And he spent time with the marginalized, the abused, the sex workers, and those who were sinners, described as sinners. So the compassionate love of Jesus is good news for those who struggle with their sexuality and their gender identity. Although some people may find that their sexual brokenness is healed through the power of the Holy Spirit, many people, many Christians with gender dysphoria, or those who have sexual desires that they wish to be released from, never find complete healing in this life. Many heterosexual married Christians also continue to struggle with their own sexuality. So the Christian community should be a place in which all are received and welcomed and treated with respect and honour as beings made in God's image, even if we cannot condone their sexual behaviour. We're called to speak the truth in love, finding a Christ-like compassion of grace and truth in how we engage with those who are struggling with gender dysphoria and other issues. So I think this is a very helpful and important thing. Truth without grace can be hard and intolerant and do a lot of damage. Grace without truth appears soft and appealing, but ultimately it is powerless and it's a lie. But the combination of grace and truth, when they are intermingled together, represents the being and character of Jesus himself. And we see this in John chapter 1. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. What about gender dysphoria? Well, most Christian physicians in the UK and the USA have concluded that hormonal or surgical treatment is rarely helpful. Instead, compassion, acceptance, pastoral support, and possibly some form of counselling or talking therapy is the best approach. For many Christians who find that their sexual desires and drives cannot be fulfilled in heterosexual marriage, the right course is one of redemptive celibacy and sublimation. That's a Freudian term, which means channeling and transforming the sexual drives and longings into healthy and Christ-like non-sexual friendships and service to others. And finally, God's plan for this age is not to abolish suffering. There's always going to be suffering around sex and sexual identity, but to transform and redeem it through the power of the Holy Spirit into blessing and healing. And so many of us only find partial healing and continue to struggle with disordered sexual desires whilst recognizing that this phrase is temporary and that we're going to find complete healing in the new heaven and new earth. So whilst the Christian faith treats sexuality and sexual behavior as being of great importance, it also relativizes these things in the light of the new heaven and the new earth. In the coming kingdom, there will be no marriage or sexual relationships between redeemed humans, whereas I believe that intimate non-sexual friendships, which we have here on earth, are going to continue into eternity, into the new heaven and the new earth. Our bodies will be transformed to be like the risen and glorious body of Christ. The pain of disordered sexuality and sexual longing will be abolished. Together, we will become united as the bride of Christ, and the true meaning of marriage will ultimately be revealed. So just a few, here are some books. They'll be available in the PDF if you want to take it a bit further. My own books, Matters of Life and Death, outlines this fourfold creation, fall, redemption, future, hope. And the one on the right, Transforming Friendship, is a vision for non-sexual friendship and how that can be so important. And just some organizations, there are two organizations in the UK which you could go onto their websites. One is called Living Out. They have lots of resources, including material for youth, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. And the second one is True Freedom Trust, which has been set up particularly for Christians with same-sex attraction, both male and female, and provides excellent resources for there. And my own website, johnwyatt.com, has got other resources as well. So I'm going to end there and hand back to the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. John Wyatt, for explaining so beautifully. I think this might have cleared many confusions, and he has how beautifully he explained the creation of man, the fall, the redemption, and future hope. Thank you so much once again, Dr. John. So now we'll be going for the question answer part. So we have received few questions. So now may I request Michelle to start with the questions. Over to you, Michelle. Over to you, Michelle.
Hello. Yes, so we have some questions that have come in. So one of the questions is, what is the biblical perspective on LGBTQ issues, and how can Christians approach individuals in the LGBTQ community with love while maintaining their faith?
Dr. John, please unmute.
Sorry, yeah. I tried to show how I think we should approach. The first thing is this the importance of showing genuine empathy and compassion. So often, people from the LGBTQ community assume that Christians are going to be the enemy. They assume that Christians are going to be antagonistic, phobic, condemnatory, prejudiced. And unfortunately, therefore, we have a lot of work to do as Christians to show genuine compassion and understanding. And therefore, I think we just have to start by asking people to explain to us how they see these issues and show that we're prepared to listen, we're prepared to empathize, often with a great deal of suffering. People express a great deal of pain and about frustration, about the prejudice they experience, often about mental health, anxiety, depression, even suicidal thoughts and so on. So our first call is to empathize. But then I think this combination of grace and truth, there's a slogan I like which says, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So we start with showing that level of caring, but then just gently to be able to share our own understanding about what it means to be human, what it means to be made in God's image. So that starts by saying whatever people do, they are people of unique value. They're people of, that's a message that they need to hear, I think, so often, that they're valued, that they're treated with love and not with contempt. They're treated with respect. But then gently we can express and question, do you think your lifestyle, that this is the best way to live? What is driving you? What's motivating you? And I think if we can build up a level of trust, build up a level of friendship, then that's the way that we can gently start to lead people to Christ. And I think that it's the figure of Christ, isn't it? The Christ who was a friend of the outcasts, the Christ who wept with those who wept, the Christ who is such an attractive figure. Ultimately, I think that is the way to reach out to people within this community.
Is it done, sir? May I proceed with the next question?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for clearing this question. So now we move to the second question. How do we support LGBT individuals without endorsing behavior that conflicts with Christian belief? I repeat, how do we support LGBT individuals without endorsing behaviors that conflict with Christian beliefs?
And so this is why it's important to distinguish between loving the person versus accepting their behavior or supporting or their behavior, confirming their behavior. And again, we turn to the example of Jesus. Jesus spent time and showed genuine interest and compassion, but didn't condone their behavior. A classic example is the woman who was taken in adultery. You remember the story in John's Gospel that this woman was presented in front of Jesus, and you can imagine all the rabbis around in all their black and they all had a rock and they're all staring at this woman. And then they testing Jesus, and they say the law says that the person taken in adultery should be stoned. What are you going to say? And Jesus' response is to say, let him without sin cast the first stone. And he whereas all those women are treating her with hatred and contempt, he is the one person who is treating her with respect. And my wife loves this story. She has suggested to me that the reason why Jesus looks down at the ground, because the gospel account says that Jesus looks at the ground, she says it's very likely that this woman was almost naked. She was either naked or had very little clothes on. And you can imagine the stares of all the men at her with hatred and disgust. And Jesus refuses to shame her so he stares at the ground. And eventually, when they've all left, Jesus gets up and he looks at her. But instead of looking at her with hatred, he looks at her with compassion. And he says, neither do I condemn you. He's the one person in the room who has the right to condemn her, and he doesn't do it. But he doesn't leave it there. He doesn't leave it by showing respect, because it's truth and grace. It's grace and truth. So he then says, go and sin no more. In other words, once she knows that she's accepted, once she knows that here is a safe person who respects her, then she's ready to hear the truth. So it's just a beautiful little vignette of how we can love the person without necessarily saying that what you're doing is good. But our first responsibility, it seems to me, particularly as healthcare professionals, is to show that we treat people with respect, and then we look for opportunities to explore gently with them. Do you think this is a good way to behave? Do you think there might be a better way? And particularly, you know, in my experience, the people who have the greatest authority to speak to those who come from this community are Christian believers who themselves have found, who are same-sex attracted, but who have found the healing of the gospel for themselves, and they are able to live as celibate Christians following Jesus and not adapting an LGBTQ lifestyle. They have the authority, the personal authority, to be able to talk to people in this community in a way that I, as a heterosexual male, can't. And so that's the wonderful role of organizations like the True Freedom Trust, is that they're able to speak with great authenticity because they themselves understand what it means to be same-sex attracted, and yet they're living celibate lives and witnessing to the power of Christ.
Thank you. So we have another question. As pediatricians, how should we approach or counsel an adolescent patient who has attraction to the same sex, considering that most of them have mental issues like depression and bullying?
Yes, thanks. This is a very important issue for pediatricians, and indeed all medics who deal with young people. And that is, we're increasingly aware that issues to do with sexuality in young children and adolescents, so both same-sex attraction, but also gender dysphoria, a desire to change gender and so on, it's very, very common that these symptoms coexist with other pathologies, with other processes, particularly with autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, other mental health difficulties and so on, and sometimes learning difficulties. And therefore, it's really important that very careful multidisciplinary assessment is taken place with these children. Ideally, one would make sure that they are seen by a range of professionals, so that, you know, they have psychological and psychiatric, developmental assessment, biological, medical assessment, in order to get a full picture. And although the presenting condition may be one of gender dysphoria or same-sex attraction, it's very often a reflection of deeper underlying problems, and therefore it's really important to try and address the deeper issue, to identify it first of all, and then address the deeper issue, rather than just to focus on the presenting complaint. And here in the UK, we've had a major report called the CAS report, which looked at the transgender services and so-called gender-affirming care, and has come up with very strong recommendations that all children under the age of 16 should receive this multidisciplinary assessment in specialist centres. Okay, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Now we have the next question. How would you advise a parent whose teenage or adult child comes out of closet with the confession of their same-sex attraction? I repeat, how would you advise a parent whose teenage or adult child comes out of the closet with the confession of their same-sex attraction?
Yeah, thanks. This is a very common phenomenon, and in fact, a number of my close friends who are parents have had this this phenomenon where a much-loved child has said to the parents that they're same-sex attracted, and that or even that they're transgender and they wish to change their gender identity. And this takes a great deal of love and compassion. I think obviously it's unhelpful if parents just respond with horror or with punishment or ostracism. All these responses are not helpful. I think the first calling again is to show love and empathy and concern. And it's then to try and explore with the child what are the what's behind this, and to try to divorce it from this kind of identity politics. It's been known for many, many years, for centuries, that many children, as a developmental stage, go through periods when they may seem to be self-attracted, same-sex attracted. It's quite common for girls going through adolescence to have, we used to call it a crush on a female teacher or on another female child, and the same thing is very common, particularly in same-sex schools with boys, where older boys develop attractions for younger boys and so on. In most cases, in the past, these were purely temporary phenomena, and as children grew older, they developed more common heterosexual orientation. So, whereas what's like to happen today is that if a boy, for instance, suddenly experiences some kind of attraction for another male, he immediately says, "Good grief, my identity. This is my identity. It's who I am. I'm gay." Instead of recognizing that it's quite common for some fluctuations in orientation to occur during adolescence. So I think as a parent, it's often about just showing love, showing patience, exploring. Similarly with transgender, it used to be very common for there to be a range. For instance, some girls love to dress in a very, quote, girly way, and they love doing all sorts of and having girly clothes and earrings and so on. And then some girls just didn't like that. They wanted to be much more like we used to call it a tomboy. They like to dress up with boys' clothes and so on. That was, again, just expressing their personality without in any sense questioning their gender identity. But now what would happen is that a girl who seemed to want to dress in boy clothes, immediately this would be seen as an identity issue. And now she's actually wanting to change her gender identity and so on. So I think it's important not to estimate these fluctuating changes, which are quite common in adolescence. I think that I would advise a parent to try and get help from people who have greater experience in these kind of issues, to seek Christian help from other counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, or whatever, just to be able to explore what might be a deeper roots behind these expressions of same-sex attraction or of gender dysphoria.
Thank you. So there's another question. Being intimate without having sexual relations seem a bit contradictory. Isn't being intimate same as having sexual relation? Physical sexual relationship seems to be the most intimate way of expression of love between two individuals, of course, under the covenant of marriage. Since Christian ethics condone same-sex sexual relations, won't we be kind of reinforcing something similar in thoughts is okay, rather than physically indulging in the act?
Thanks very much. That's a really good question. So this is very much what the secular world says. The secular world says the only way in which you can express intimacy with another human being is in a sexual way. That if you wish to be really close to another human being, you have this longing to reach out to another human being, that is sexual, and it must be expressed sexually. That's the only way. You cannot have intimacy without sexual expression. And I just want to say that is a complete lie. It's a lie of the evil one. Because, of course, what it says is that those who don't have the privilege of marriage, of heterosexual marriage, by definition, can't have intimacy. That intimacy is only available for those who are married. And that is just wrong. And it's obvious that it's wrong. If you stop and think about it, celibacy, if you go back to previous eras of the Christian history, most of the outstanding leaders of the church were not married. Most of them were celibate. most of them, both male and female. Are you saying that the majority of Christians that have ever lived couldn't express intimacy? And then even more extraordinary, of course, Jesus didn't have sexual expression. He was a celibate male, and yet he was fully human. He was the second Adam. Are you saying that the second Adam couldn't have intimate relations with other human beings? I had the privilege of having a very, very close friendship with actually many other people, a whole group of very close friends. And there's a wonderful openness in that I'm able, with some of these friends, to be able to talk about the most intimate, secret parts of my identity and share it with them. And they too can share with me. And therefore there is a deep psychological and emotional intimacy between us, and yet it is completely non-sexual. So if we put all our even if we're married, if we put all our intimacy needs into our married partners, we actually put a huge pressure on the marriage. So we actually need to develop a network of friendships, whether we're married or not. We need close friendships which are non-sexual but are still intimate. In other words, there is a deep level of openness between us. And that's really what my book is about. What I say, however, is that we've got to be aware of the possibility that these friendships can go wrong. And in particular, there are 3 red flags which we need to watch out for when friendship starts to go wrong. And the first, obviously, is that if the friendship can become sexualized. So we now know that any friendship can start off as non-sexual, but it can become sexualized. But that's not just between male and female friendships. So male-male friendships can become sexualized, and female-female friendships can become sexualized. And so therefore, as soon as we're aware of any sexual element entering into a friendship, that ought to be a red flag. The second area is that friendships should be non-coercive or non-manipulative. As soon as we're aware of some kind of manipulative element coming into a relationship, that's the red flag. And the third thing is that friendships should be non-exclusive. And this is where friendships differ from marriage. So marriage, as we've said, is intended to be exclusive. And we all know that if I'm unfaithful to my wife, or she's unfaithful to me in our marriage, that destroys this exclusivity bond of marriage. The paradox of friendship is I can have this incredibly close friendship with one person and then develop a friendship with another person, or he or she can develop a friendship with another person, and that in no way weakens our friendship. In fact, if I discover my friend has another friend, I'd say, isn't that wonderful? They've too discovered how wonderful this person is. So my challenge to those who are listening is, please work on your friendships, develop close, intimate friendships, but non-sexual friendships. And my book, Transforming Friendship, if you're interested, explores that in greater detail. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. So now we have the next question. So in Genesis chapter 9, verse 12 to 17, we see the rainbow as a sign given to us by God for a new covenant after the flood. In view of this, do you think there is a deliberate agenda the LGBTQ movement has against this covenant by taking and defiling the rainbow? Do you think Christians need to reclaim the rainbow?
Gosh, that's a very interesting question. And to be honest, I haven't thought of that, but it's an interesting idea. I think, I suspect that the charities, when they adopted this slogan, were not thinking about Genesis chapter 9 and the covenant after the flood. But I think they adopted it because they wish to show a kind of acceptance amongst all different types of people. Having said that, I think it's an interesting point that this very powerful image of God's creation, a covenantal faithfulness to his creation has in some sense been defiled or changed by its adoption as a slogan. And it does mean that you have to be very careful about how you use a rainbow, because as soon as if you ever use that as a rainbow, as kind of publicity or anything, it will be immediately interpreted as support for LGBTQ activism. So therefore, it is true, isn't it, that signs change and their meanings change, and this is the reality of a constantly changing world.
Thank you. So the next question, we have two questions. What is your say on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament? And can LGBTQ people hold a position in church?
Well, thanks. So as people know, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was God's judgment on the terrible activities that were going on, including the sexual activities in those cities. I think the first thing to say is that the activities that in Sodom and Gomorrah that was condemned by God was not just same-sex activities, but it was actually rape and abuse. If you remember, Lot suggested giving his daughters so that the people outside could abuse them, which was a horrific proposal. But what it showed was that the sexual practices that were going on in that town were not simply same-sex attraction, but also horrific abuse, sexual abuse of all kinds. So I think that clearly God's judgment on horrific sexual practices, particularly abusive, rape, and so on, is clear. And yet, again, I come to the way that Jesus treated prostitutes and sex workers. There's absolutely no doubt that in first century Palestine, homosexual activities, including homosexual prostitutes as well as female prostitutes, male and female, was common. And the word was used was a generic word in Greek, porneia, which covered both male and female heterosexual and homosexual sin. And yet Jesus was described as a friend of sinners. So as I say, the example that we see in Jesus and in the early church was that although they maintained very clear sexual standards themselves, they were seen as people who reached out to those who had a different lifestyle. Is it possible for people to take leadership in churches? Well, I think it's clear from the New Testament that anybody who takes church leadership has to have a lifestyle which is consistent with the gospel and with the teaching of the Bible. And that means that both heterosexual sin in terms of behavior and homosexual behavior are inappropriate and would disqualify someone from being a church leader in biblical terms. But that's not the same as same-sex attraction. As we said before, Jesus was tempted in all the ways that we are, yet without sin. And the natural understanding of that text means that Jesus also had same-sex attraction, that he was tempted in that way. And yet, he was the sinless Son of God. And so we draw a distinction between the temptation and the behavior. And so we insist on strong standards for the behavior for church leaders, but we don't regard the temptation itself as being equivalent to sin. Okay, back to you.
Thank you so much, sir. So we have the next question. Is there a casual explanation as to why situation of gender dysphoria and same-sex relationship appear to have increased over time? A reaction to an aggressive world, allowable transparency.
Sorry, could you just repeat the end of that question?
Is there a casual explanation as to why situation of gender dysphoria and same-sex relationship appear to have increased over time? A reaction to an aggressive world, allowable transparency.
I think it's very difficult to know what are the causal mechanisms. I mean, these are very complex sociological, psychological, political, even economic factors, as well as spiritual issues. And I think trying to dissect out exactly why there is this huge change going on in society is not easy. I do recommend the Truman books. Carl Truman has written these two books. If you wish to try to understand more about the sociological and philosophical and spiritual forces and the history behind all this, I think he gives a very good and detailed explanation, and I personally found it very helpful. So I think it is possible to understand more about the forces, the psychological and spiritual forces that are going on in our world. But in the end, it's not for us to explain. It's for us to find a way to respond in a Christ-like way. So we're never going to fully understand why these phenomena are happening, but it is our calling to try to present Christ and a Christ-like behavior in a way that is attractive and that is also life-changing. And again, I point to these organizations like True Freedom Trust and Living Out and their literature, because these are people who themselves have been within these communities, and yet they're living lives as Christians, inconsistent with biblical standards, and they demonstrate how it's possible to live, and they speak with great authenticity and with great authority because of their experiences.
Thank you. So the next question is, if children who have been abused in their younger years develop same-sex attraction or opposite-sex phobia, and they feel they are unable to either be attracted to the opposite sex or driven towards the same sex, how do we deal with these situations?
Gosh, thanks. Well, that's a very sad reality that we now know that so many children suffer both physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in childhood. We now know that this has been a sad reality of children for thousands of years, since the history of humankind. It's a real expression of the fall, isn't it? And yet, it's only been in the last, 20, 30, 40 years that we have started to uncover first the reality of physical abuse, and now increasingly the reality of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse. But thank God, along with these discoveries have come new ways of helping people with a history of trauma and abuse. My wife is a trained professional counsellor, and in her work, she's worked with many women who have suffered childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse, and she helps them in the process of recovery, trauma recovery, and for some, spiritual healing and renewal by becoming Christians. So the answer is that there is a journey, there is a way back, even for people who have suffered abuse. And if there are people on this call who have themselves suffered abuse of some form in the past and have a history of abuse and trauma, can I plead with you to reach out to get skilled professional help, because there is a path for recovery, but it does require really skilled and experienced help from counsellors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on, and ultimately, it is the healing of Christ. Christ offers healing, internal healing, and it's not that the wounds can be just go away. They never go away, but genuine healing can occur, and God loves to bring blessing and healing out of terrible suffering and shame and trauma. It is possible, but it's not an easy road. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. So we have the next question. How condescending is it to prescribe celibacy to those who themselves don't practice it? I repeat, how condescending is it to prescribe celibacy to those who themselves don't practice it?
It's a very good point, and clearly, I am at the moment married in a happy marriage, and therefore, at the moment, I'm not called to celibacy. But of course, I don't know what there was. For 30 years, I was a single man, and I was trying to live as a celibate single man. So I have quite a lot of experience of being celibate, and I don't know what the future will hold. At some time, it's very likely that I will be called to be a celibate man again in the future. So celibacy is not unusual. It's very common for all of us. But I think the greatest authenticity comes from those, as I've said before, of people who are living celibate lives and living in a way which is honouring to Christ, and therefore it often is celibate Christians, single Christians, who have the greatest authenticity in this area. And I would encourage you to try to find Christians who are able to, from their own experience, to talk about living celibate lives, and ask them to speak from their own personal experience and struggles, because clearly it can be very hypocritical for church leaders who are married to recommend celibacy without themselves experiencing how hard it is. Having said that, part of this sexual obsession about our modern world is that for many secular people, to try to live a celibate life seems to be utterly ludicrous. It's almost like expecting someone to live a life without eating or without drinking or without getting angry. It's just part of humanity, they think, sexual expression. And again, this is a very weird modern perspective, because again, in the history of the church, as I said, many people, perhaps the majority of Christian followers, were celibate, and they certainly didn't regard it as strange, and they certainly didn't regard it as impossible. And that was because they didn't think that sexual behavior was really that important. They thought that non-sexual love and friendship and community, these things were much more important than sexual expression. So it's really the fact that our modern world has massively overvalued sexuality and sexual expression that then means that celibacy starts to look like completely weird and impossible. And we just need to restore our understanding that, okay, sex is important, but it's not that important. It's not that central to our lives. And instead, we need to find other ways of developing strong, and I use the word again, intimate friendships that are non-sexual. Okay.
Right. So we have another question. There's a law in the pipeline where Namibia is about to legalize same-sex marriage. How can we as Christians fight this law without protesting or sounding aggressive, which may come across to the LGBTQ community as hatred? The Christians are praying because our fight is not against flesh. However, it seems as if more has to be done in terms of acting on our faith.
Yes, the whole topic of same-sex marriage, again, is complicated. It's actually rather ironic, because marriage, of course, is an exclusively Christian or a particularly Christian. It's not exclusively Christian, of course. Other cultures have marriage, but it's Christianity in particular which sees marriage as a reflection of the relationship between Christ and the church, which has this very high view of marriage. And so it's marriage which is being promoted by Christianity, and it's therefore rather strange that LGBTQ communities should be so keen to have the right to have marriage when it's and to describe themselves as being married, when that is really very much something that comes and is supported within the Christian foundation. So, having said that, I think this is more a question of how we engage in a political sense. I'm just going to move I'll just move that, get the sun out of my eyes. The question is, from what I hear in Namibia, the question is, how do we act as salt and light in a political environment? And of course, it's rather different from how we would how to decide what is right within the Christian community. That's one thing. How to decide to act in a political environment, that is a different thing. It's not the same thing. We're called to be salt and light in our secular world. That means, in particular, we're called to fight against corruption in evil. On the one hand, that's the role of salt, and light is to penetrate into dark places and to show a better way to live. So, in a democratic society, as Christians, we're not free to impose our will in society, but we are free to try to persuade others. So the question would be for my brothers and sisters in Namibia, how could we argue the case for Christian marriage in a way that is persuasive? And that takes wisdom. It takes an understanding of the political process, and it's a way of finding arguments. By and large, to just say, well, the Bible says this is wrong, is not going to be helpful. But if we could find arguments based, for instance, on social cohesion or on what's best for the country as a whole, we may be able to exercise a political role. But I think the truth is that many of us who wish to follow Bible-based ethics, we have to recognize that we're a small minority within our countries. And therefore, although we may try to argue the case in the political arena, we have to accept that very often we can't be successful. We have to, in the end, God calls us to be faithful, not to be successful. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Seems like we are running out of time. So this will be our last questions. We have received many questions. Sorry for not being able to attend or answer all those questions. I think Dr. John has addressed most of the questions in a very elaborate manner, in a very clear manner. So this will be the last question for tonight. So it goes, how should a Christian marriage actually happen? How does God lead? How to be sure of God? Only men need to pursue women. Do only men need to pursue women?
So how this is, you're asking me for marriage guidance here, or to how to find a partner. And of course, there are many cultural differences behind how marriage and how finding a partner operates in the UK and in other countries around the world. I think the important thing is, what am I looking for in a partner? What am I looking for? If I'm a woman looking for a marriage partner, if I'm a man looking for a marriage partner, what am I looking for? And ultimately, it's a question of looking for someone with whom I can serve together. You know, in the secular world, as we've already said, sex and often marriage is presented as the source of all meaning. You know, I need somebody else who's going to bring meaning and purpose and friendship and happiness and love into my life, because without them, my life is just of no value. And of course, this is a very false and romanticized and idealized view of marriage. Instead, I think we should be looking for a partner with whom we can serve together. In the New Testament, it says, don't be unequally yoked. And the image is of having two animals pulling a plow. And if you have a cow or a horse and a donkey trying to pull together, it's not going to work. You need to have animals that can pull together if the plow is going to be effective. And that's the image about marriage. It's not a beautiful romantic image. It's an image that says, can you and this other person pull in such a way to serve the Christian church? Can you be of value in the kingdom together? Can you be equally yoked? And so I'm praying that God will lead me to a partner with whom I can be equally yoked, who together we can serve. So that's the question. By all means, develop friendships, non-sexual friendships with people of the opposite sex. Be sure that your friendships are pure and are not sexualized. And ask yourself the question, is this a person with whom I can be equally yoked? Is this a person with whom I could pull together and serve Christ and the Christian church together? Because that's really the primary joy of marriage, the primary joy. Of course, there's the benefit of friendship and sexual relations and so on, but these things are not the center. The center is in serving Christ together, of being equally yoked. And if God calls you to the single life, then see that also as a gift, the gift of singleness, and that you can use that gift to serve him. So let's try to avoid these secular ideas that put sex and sexual relationships at the center. And let's see instead that serving Christ and learning to become the people that he made us is our primary calling. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Wyatt, for giving us this time. We are all grateful for the insight you have given us today. We apologize for not being able to cover all the questions. However, a recording of this session will be made available in your emails in a few days for all who have registered. Over to you, Dr. Sudeep.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Wyatt. Thank you so much, Michelle. Now, may I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Santosh Matthew. He'll speak a few words for us.
I just want to say thank you to Professor John and all of you facilitators, the hosts who did an excellent job, and also all the participants who joined. I know we have just touched the surface of the issue. There are much more issues, deeper questions you may have. You can put those in your emails and send emails to us. We can try to get back to you or create a group through which we can interact. Thank you once again for joining us. Thank you, John, for being there for us.
God bless you all. Thank you so much for being part of this great event.